Program is sponsored by Friends of Life Outreach International.
One of the worst days of my life was Mother's Day when he was 12, and it had been a hard day. We knew he was depressed. As I kind of tucked him in that night in the dark, I was just kind of prayed with him and was getting ready to walk out the room. And as I started to leave, he said, "Mom, would you kill me and put me out of my misery?"
Coming up on Life Today, spend Wednesdays in the Word with a tender moment as Kay Warren opens up about her son Matthew and the circumstances leading to his suicide.
Hi, I'm Sheila Walsh. Thanks for joining me in Wednesdays in the Word. You know, one of the things I love about the book of Psalms is how honest the psalmist David is. You know, do you ever read them out loud? Sometimes I do. Sometimes if I'm having a really rough day. And I love the fact that he doesn't pretend always to be okay. You know, even if you look at Psalm 42, he'll say, David said, "Why am I discouraged? Why is my heart so sad?" Now, he'll go on to say, "I will put my hope in God. I will praise him again." But he's saying, you know what, at the moment, that's not where I'm at. I'm really struggling. And I cannot tell you how the Psalms of David have helped me in some of my darkest days. And one of the things that I feel passionately about is to bring that kind of honesty to us in the church when it comes to those who struggle with darkness a lot. We've not always been that great in the church at dealing with mental illness and understanding those who struggle with mental illness. And so I actually consider it a privilege that I do have a mental illness. It means I can look at somebody else who's having a hard time and say, you know what, me too, I get it, and you're not alone. But I don't know anybody who God is using more profoundly in our nation at the moment to address these issues than my friend who's with me today, Kay Warren. Thanks for being here, Kay.
Hey, Sheila.
It's hard for me to ask you about the most devastating thing that happened in your life, because I feel as if talking about your son, Matthew, I feel like I'm treading on holy ground. But I feel that you have a perspective of, as a mother of a son who struggled with mental illness for some time, can you give us a little perspective of what that journey looks like and feels like?
Well, as hard as it is to talk about, I'm so glad that you ask. And I'm so glad that you are willing to talk about your own life and your own struggles. And it's one of the things I admire so deeply about you. And I ask that God would refresh you as you refresh others with your vulnerability and your openness. My Matthew was amazing. But he had mental illness from the time he was very young. He was diagnosed with clinical depression when he was 7, but he could have been diagnosed earlier if we'd known that children can have a mental illness. We didn't know. We just thought he was different than his brother and sister. We thought that the ways that he acted and the ways that he thought that he would outgrow them. We didn't know that he was living with a mental illness from the time he was about 3 or 4. I mean, who knew that children could struggle that young? But he did. And he struggled until the day he died when he was 27. And his illness got worse and worse. He definitely fell into the category of severe mental illness. If I could just digress for a second, sometimes with mental illness, that's what we think of. We think of someone so ill, like my son, who can't really function in this life. But actually, I have lived with depression my whole life. Not severe depression, but I have depression. Everybody feels anxious sometimes. It's when those things start to cross over and get in the way of normal life. You know, when anxiety and depression, or just you can't cope with friends or work or job, then it starts moving over into mental illness. But even so, that's not that everybody's like my Matthew. But he lived most of his life with a severe mental illness. He started talking about suicide when he was 12. Since he's died, I've found some of his writings where he was actually talking about it sooner, but we didn't know it. One of the worst days of my life was Mother's Day when he was 12, and it had been a hard day. We knew he was depressed. As I kind of tucked him in that night in the dark, I was just kind of prayed with him and was getting ready to walk out the room. And as I started to leave, he said, "Mom, would you kill me and put me out of my misery?" And I was so glad that the room was dark because he couldn't see my face. And I managed to get through that and say, oh, buddy, I'm so sorry that you're feeling so sad. I love you so much. Did my best, walked out of the room. My older son was standing out in the hall, and I collapsed in his arms. And my thought was, no mother should ever hear her child say, please kill me on Mother's Day and put me out of my misery. But it was the agony and the torture that he lived with. And of course, doctors, medication, programs, hospitalizations, everything that we knew to do. And yet, by the time Matthew was 27, he didn't really want to die. He just wanted the pain to stop. And as I talk to people, that is what I hear over and over again. I don't really want to die. I just want the pain to stop. And there is that sense of sometimes people feeling, as he obviously did, the day that he took his life, that there was no other way out. There was no option. It was never going to be any different. So my heart just, it was the worst day of my life. It was my nightmare that he would eventually take his life. And I can tell you that we were devastated and are devastated, but we are not destroyed. And that's the hope for us and for anyone living with mental illness. There can be devastation, but it does not mean that you will be destroyed. I believe that. I believe it for us, even though we've lost our Matthew. He's in heaven. He's in the arms of Jesus. And so I know I'll see him again. So even for him, the devastation was not complete. God redeems. And in our lives, his dad and I and his brother and sister, all those who loved him, devastation, but we are not destroyed.
One of the things that I'm so grateful that you and Rick are very much involved in is helping educate the church. Because last year I was speaking in a church and I talked about my father's suicide. And I said, so many people called my father a coward. They don't understand how hard he fought to make it to 33. You know, that's not the act of a coward. He just come to a place where he couldn't do it anymore.
Makes me mad.
I know.
It makes me mad when people, because it just shows they don't understand.
Yeah.
And I just try to say they don't understand and not stay angry. But when people say that that's a coward's way out, no, I'm sorry, they don't have any idea. That just means you have never walked in despair's shoes. If you've walked in despair's shoes, you know that it takes every ounce of courage to live one more day, to get out of bed one more day, to face those sometimes screaming voices in your head that tell you to end it, that it's never going to change, the enemy wanting to take you down, to live one more day and to fight through one more day of that takes the greatest amount of courage. I actually think some of the greatest heroes, when we get to heaven, are going to be the people that as we see them and as we meet all the other folks in heaven, some of the greatest heroes are going to be the people who fought every single day of their life to live.
I absolutely agree with that. But the thing that was devastating for me was after I had talked about how I couldn't wait for that day when I'd see my dad again. And at the end, a woman had to practically carry this young woman to talk to me because her dad had committed suicide 6 months before, and the church had told her dad was in hell. And my heart was just broken for her. And I wanted to find the people who told him that and say, where did you find them?
First I want to pound them, and then I want to show them the verses in the scripture.
So cruel.
Yes, it is.
What do you see a shift, Kay? Do you think we're learning more in the church about how to deal? Yeah, slowly.
Really slowly, especially around suicide. I think there's some great progress around talking about mental illness. I think that as people understand more and more that it's real and it's common and it's treatable, that it's not that you're weak in character, or that if you just pray a little bit more, or if you can confess a sin, when they understand that mental illness is an illness, I think that that's helping in the church with people getting rid of the stigma. But when it comes to suicide and suicidal thoughts, it's a much slower progression of understanding. And for us to be able, this may sound weird, but it gives me such joy to be able to talk to families who have lost someone who their family member loved Jesus, and yet they're fearful of where they are. And I love to be able to bring the comfort to them of John 10, where Jesus said, I know my sheep and they are in my hands, and no one can take them out of my hands. And I've had people say, but what if this person took themselves out of Jesus? And I'm like, excuse me, he said no one can take them out of my hands. Romans 8, nothing can separate us, neither life nor death, nor demons or principalities, or nothing can separate us from the love of God through Jesus Christ. So to be able to say to people, your loved one loved Jesus, they're in his arms.
Yeah. My dad was an amazing singer, and his favorite hymn that he used to sing was, "There were 99 that safely lay in the shelter of the fold."
Yes, I know that.
And it took me, I was probably in my late 30s when I had the courage to go to the place where my dad drowned himself. But what I thought might have been a place of tremendous despair actually was a place of tremendous peace, because I felt as if Jesus said, you know, that night I went out and I found my lost sheep and I carried him home.
Carried him. I say when his body fell, he shot himself, and as his body fell, Jesus grabbed him. There were angels in that room, and they carried him into the presence of God. He didn't hit the ground alone and out of Jesus' love. Jesus was there. Jesus caught him. Jesus caught him.
I had the privilege of speaking at your church and mental health symposium. And I know this is an ongoing, passionate work for you. Do you see, there was quite an interesting group of people you had there. One of the gentlemen I got to speak to had been the former head of the American Psychiatric Association. I loved him. I had lunch with him. And
well, he loved you.
But I remember him saying to me, mental illness is not curable, but it's treatable. Yes. And I thought that was fantastic information for people who think, well, because I've had people say to me, well, Sheila, do you still take medication? And I'm like, yes, I do. And
Absolutely.
I take that pill with a prayer of thanksgiving every day.
Yes, that's
and they're
right.
like, well, don't you believe Jesus can heal you? And I'm like, I absolutely believe he can, and if he will, I'll let you know.
That's right.
And until then, I'll take my pill with a prayer of thanksgiving.
Absolutely. Yeah, that goes to that, you know, still trying to dispel that stigma around mental illness as being something that is your character, or if you just try harder or pray harder, whatever, that it's going to go away. Does Jesus heal instantly? Of course he does. We all know the stories. People who are healed of addiction in an instant. People who are healed of cancer. Yes, he does it. He doesn't usually choose to do that, though. And so for the rest of us who don't receive that kind of an instantaneous miracle, it doesn't have anything to do with faith. It has to do with God's sovereignty and what he has chosen to do in each person's life. So what I try to tell people is there's not just any one solution or one way to deal with mental illness. We're a whole. God's made us body, soul, and spirit. There's things that have to happen in our minds, things that have to happen in our bodies, and things that have to happen in our emotions to give us the ability to manage a mental illness well. So go to your doctor. See if take blood tests, see if there's something that's going on that's causing some of those symptoms. Eat as well as you can. Get sleep, exercise, take care of your body. Go and get a diagnosis from a psychiatrist if these things are not helping. See if there's a medication that you might need to be on. Emotionally, you and I all have broken places that we need healing, ways that we've adapted to life. Therapy, counseling, I'm a big believer. I've done my share of it. Relationally, people with mental illness tend to burn bridges with relationships, so there's healing. And spiritually, I mean, draw close to God in intimacy. We are whole beings. And so for mental illness to be managed, all of those things need to transpire. Medication, but Sheila, I know you would say you're also working on your relationship with Jesus every single day. And
also acknowledging spiritual warfare.
Right.
We don't just fight against flesh and
That's
blood.
Right. That's
I mean,
right.
There's been nights when that's been part of my story all my life, that I've struggled with suicidal thoughts. And sometimes my only prayer is just the name of Jesus. There's nights where literally that's all I can do is just speak the name of Jesus.
I don't know if you understand the power of what you just said on a television show to millions of people, that you said, I have lived with suicidal thoughts my whole life. And yet here you sit, Sheila, as somebody who's saying, Jesus Christ is my all in all. I will live every day of my life for him. The freedom that you saying that, I mean, I'm a little bit I don't even know the words. I just feel like God is unchaining people who have lived with such shame about their own mental illness and their suicidal thoughts. Who do they tell? Who do they tell? For you to say that,
Don't you think it's just time that we shine the brightest light into the darkest corners of the church?
It is.
That whatever you're struggling with, whatever it is, you know, one of my favorite verses in Psalm 56, it says that God gathers all our tears, he catches them in his bottle. And I think that there's, in fact, I have a little, I stuck it in my pocket before I left today. This actually is a little tear bottle. And I think that one of the most profound things, because I think there's some people, probably even watching, who think, nobody on this earth understands the weight of what I've wept or how much, but God does. He understands the weight.
He does.
I have maybe a strange question, but did Matthew ever feel like God let him down?
Oh, I think that was one of the hardest things for us as his parents. I mean, his dad wrote a book called The Purpose-Driven Life, and to have his son struggle with God and God's purpose for him, it was such agony for Rick to know that he could help so many other people, and yet his dearest son struggled with finding and hearing God's purpose. Matthew accepted Christ as a little boy and loved Jesus, but as he got older and his own personal struggles were magnified and became more intense, and as the mental illness clouded his thinking and interrupted some of the logical, clear thoughts that you and I have, he began to feel like that God had let him down. I watched my son sometimes say, I just need him to come and sit on this couch and tell me why he's allowed so much pain and suffering in this world. Why did he allow me as a little boy to live my whole life wanting to be close to him and yet feeling so distant? God just needs to come sit on this couch and tell me why he made the world this way. And for a long time, I would try to come up with answers. Well, that's not the way God works. You know, he's already spoken through his son. I mean, you know, all the things. But as a parent, to watch my son struggle to want to be close. And, you know, Sheila, I don't have good answers for that. I don't have some pat formula as to why.
Because it's a valid question.
Well, it's a very valid question. That's why I couldn't say, oh, you need to stop asking that question. All I could say was, buddy, I don't know, but I'm sitting on the couch next to you. I'm sitting next to you, and my arms are around you, and I'll hold your hand. And together we'll ask God to answer those questions. I don't know.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the most devastating stories in the New Testament is John the Baptist, and it's beginning of Matthew 11, when he's sitting in prison, and all he knows that Messiah is supposed to be the one who comes and releases those who sit in prison, and Jesus is not coming. And he sends his disciples and says, you know, you ask Jesus, are you the one?
Oh, so poignant.
Or did I get it wrong?
Oh, it's so poignant.
And it's when Jesus says, look, go back and tell John, you know, the blind see, the lame. But then this little phrase, and blessed is he who is not offended by me. Will you love a God who doesn't live up to your expectations, who doesn't answer prayer the way you want prayer answered? Will you worship when nothing makes sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, we prayed for Matthew to be healed. I had to deal with that myself, not only for Matthew's sorrow and struggle, but our sorrow and struggle when he died. Because Sheila, we went out on a limb. I mean, we were so far out on that faith limb that God was going, I felt like God had given me a word. I had done a fleece, the old Gideon fleece thing, and I felt like God had given me a fleece that he was going to heal Matthew here.
Wow.
And when Matthew died, it was crushing. Not only just to lose my son, but to, like John the Baptist, I felt like that same thing. I'm sitting there, wait. You're the releaser of those behind bars. You're the freedom guy. Where was that for Matthew? And to struggle through and to understand as best I can. I have a little mystery pot. I have this little pot where I throw all my questions. It's a little ceramic pot because there's questions that I don't know what to do with. I don't have good answers. What I do know is that I trust God with all that I am. I have more hope than I've ever had. But do I have God figured out? Not in the slightest. So all those questions of why didn't he heal Matthew? Why didn't he answer Matthew's prayer in the way that Matthew prayed? Why didn't he let John the Baptist out of the prison? Why did he let him? I don't know.
Yeah.
But they go in that mystery pot. And I know that when I see Jesus face to face, that those questions, as C.S. Lewis says, will die away in the presence of the answerer himself. I'm holding on to that.
I love the fact that Kay encourages us to ask the questions. So often we think that's not holy or it's blasphemous. It's not. It actually decides how deeply you trust God, that you're willing to ask the tough, tough questions. One of the things I love about the privilege of doing what we do is that I've discovered our brokenness is a far better bridge to other people than pretend wholeness ever is. And so one of the things that we care about so much today at Life Today is being able to help those around the world who're suffering. But can I just say quickly, if you're hurting right now, if you need somebody to pray for you, just to say, hey, I get it, you're not alone, call the number on the screen. We have amazing men and women who just love to pray for you. So please, copy that number down. Maybe there's just a time that'll come up when you need somebody to just say, yeah, I'm here.